hidden meanings in this impossible Tudor portrait, which shows a family grouping which could never have occurred. In this art history documentary from History Calling, I'll discuss the motives behind this portrait's creation, its provenance, the positioning of the Tudor monarchs, why none of Henry VIII's wives are present, who the other figures in the picture are, what they represent, and what the inscription around the frame means. I'll also look at this near copy, created roughly 20 years later, at how it differs from the original, and at the older Tudor portraits that both are based on. The portrait you see here was painted in around 1572 and has been attributed to Flemish artist Lucas de Heer, though some people dispute that attribution. It is entitled An Allegory of the Tudor Succession, the Family of Henry VIII, and is an oil painting measuring 184 by 131.2 centimetres. It was given by Queen Elizabeth I to Sir Francis Walsingham. We know this because a little couplet at the bottom of it reads, "The Queen to Walsingham this tablet sent, mark of her peoples and her own content." The occasion seems to have been Walsingham's involvement in the signing of the Treaty of Blois that April. The painting presumably stayed with the Walsingham family initially, but it ended up in the collection of writer, politician and historian Horace Walpole, who died in 1797, and in 1842 it was sold from his collection and bought by J.D. Dent. It is now owned by the National Museum of Wales, whose website says they acquired it in 1991, but hangs at Sudeley Castle, where Queen Catherine Parr died and is buried. This Tudor connection is very appropriate, given the painting's origins and subject matter. It shows 4 of the Tudor monarchs, Henry VIII and Edward VI in the middle, Mary I on our left with her husband Philip of Spain next to her, and Elizabeth I on our right. Only Henry VII is missing. The portrait is of course impossible. By the time of its creation, only Elizabeth and Philip were still alive. Philip never met his father-in-law or brother-in-law either, and he did not look like this anymore by the 1570s, having been born in 1527. Not that Elizabeth, born in 1533, looked this fresh either, but she famously didn't show her age in most of her later portraits, and the manner in which she appears here is in line with how she was portrayed in the 1570s. Edward died in 1553 when he was 15, but is shown here, I think, as the boy of 9 he was when Henry VIII died in 1547. The last time Elizabeth had seen any of these people, she was no more than 25, and as little as 13 when her father died. The Tudors and Philip have therefore been plucked from very different points in time, and their clothing shows it. Philip, Mary, Henry and Edward all wear the clothes of the 1530s to 1550s, when they were alive and when Philip was married to Mary. Elizabeth, meanwhile, dresses in the fashions of the early 1570s, with a ruff, no French hood like the one Mary wears, and very different sleeves. Noticeably missing are Henry's wives. This was likely a diplomatic choice on the part of the artist. After all, which one would you show? One of the mothers of his children? Well, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, mothers of Mary and Elizabeth, were cast off and their marriages annulled, while Jane Seymour was the woman who displaced Anne, and probably not someone Elizabeth wanted to see again. Putting Anne in the picture, given her execution and the fact that her daughter was declared illegitimate, might also have undermined Elizabeth's claim to the throne, by reminding people of her dubious birthright and the scandal around her mother. Out of sight, out of mind, as the saying goes. As for Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard, they were both also abandoned and even executed in the case of the latter, plus they had no children and so made no contribution to the Tudor dynasty. That just leaves Catherine Parr, who again produced no royal children and who Henry didn't feel was important enough to include in family portraits painted even while she was his wife. More on that point later. I agree with the artist's choice here. Probably best to just avoid showing any of them. You know what you don't want to avoid doing though? Giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing to my channel so you don't miss any of my content releases. You can also find me on Patreon, where I provide bonus material like early access to ad-free videos, mini podcasts and more. I have an Amazon storefront too if you want to check out my recommendations for history-themed books, TV shows, movies and gifts. And finally, a big thank you as always to those of you who donate to the channel using the super thanks button underneath videos, as this is very kind and helps me to keep doing what I'm doing. The positioning and presentation of the figures in this room with only one wall, a floor and a roof supported by pillars is very revealing. Henry is in the centre, sitting on a golden throne beneath a green canopy of state, holding a sceptre and with the royal coat of arms above him. His feet rest on a rich, ornate carpet. Although Elizabeth was queen at the time this portrait was painted, her long-dead father is in the most important position and is the only person seated. Edward is on his left, on bended knee, receiving the sword of justice from his father, a symbol of the right to rule. Mary and Philip are to Henry's right, our left, and she is holding red roses to represent the House of Lancaster, from which the family descended on the male line. Elizabeth at first appears to be in the weakest position, off to Henry's left and not touching her father or receiving anything from him. Look closer though, and you realise that she is standing in front of the rest of the family and is therefore bigger than them, literally taking up more space in the image than any of them do. Henry is also angled towards her, as well as Edward, rather than towards Mary and Philip. There are other figures in the portrait too, dressed in classical outfits, and their presence is also loaded with meaning. Next to Mary and Philip, we see Mars, the god of war. This is an allusion to the wars which occurred during Mary's reign and the loss of Calais to the French, and Mars, despite his outfit, carries a jousting lance of the 16th century to make the connection extra clear. It is not intended as a compliment to Mary or her husband. Contrast this with Elizabeth's companions. The Queen holds the hand of a figure representing peace, who is standing on and destroying the sword of discord. Peace also stands on a shield and jousting lance, juxtaposing her even further with Mars, who wields both, while Elizabeth points to her with her free hand. Following behind them is the figure of Plenty, carrying a cornucopia full of fruit, and whose dress didn't cover up enough of her to keep YouTube happy, so I've had to add in a little modesty patch. The background images would seem to favour Elizabeth and not Mary as well. There is some debate as to what they show, however. Personally, I think that the buildings behind Mary and Philip with the multiple large domes are meant to represent the Vatican in Rome, in an allusion to their Catholicism and foreignness. Mary was half Spanish as well as being married to a Spaniard. Others have questioned if we are seeing some long-lost London buildings though. It seems to me that the buildings behind Elizabeth look more English though, and might even be Westminster Palace as she knew it. This would emphasise her connection to her homeland, to Protestantism, and to the rule of Parliament rather than the rule of the Pope. There is also a dome-like structure in the deep background here too, but this reminded me of the tops of the corners of the White Tower at the Tower of London rather than Roman buildings. You can let me know in the comments, however, which structures you think these are. Maybe I'm just saying what I expect to see in a portrait of this kind, which is so obviously slanted towards Elizabeth. What I definitely believe, however, is that the left and right-hand sides of the portrait have been deliberately painted as being literally and figuratively opposite to one another. Catholic versus Protestant, Spain versus England, war versus peace, Mary versus Elizabeth. The overall image therefore stresses several things. First, that all the children's right to rule came from their descent from Henry. This is why he is in the centre with all the accoutrements of monarchy instead of Elizabeth. Second, his Protestant children, who appear on the same side of the painting as each other, with Henry turned towards them and with more positive classical imagery around them, are better rulers than his Catholic daughter and son-in-law. Third, Elizabeth is the best of the bunch, for she literally brings peace and plenty to the realm. If you need any other evidence of this interpretation, I would direct you to the inscription around the edge of the frame, which reads, "A face of much nobility, low in a little room. 4 states with their conditions here shadowed in a show. A father more than valiant, a rare and virtuous son. A zealous daughter in her kind, what else the world doth know. And last of all, a virgin queen, to England's joy we see, successively to hold the right and virtues of the 3. No reference to Philip, you'll note. The 4 states mentioned are Henry and his children, the virtuous son is Edward, the zealous daughter is Mary, the virgin queen is of course Elizabeth, and the only father in the picture, discounting the fact that Philip had his own children, who obviously aren't shown here, is Henry. Now let's think about how this image compares to other famous Tudor portraits. Right away, I'd like to draw your attention to another picture, also called the Family of Henry VIII, and which I already have an entire video on, linked on screen and below for you. This was painted in circa 1545 by an unknown artist. When you look at it, you can see that its composition has been heavily used as a template for the later image. Once again, we find ourselves in a room with only one wall, a roof supported by pillars, and a floor. Henry, Mary, and Elizabeth are all in the same positions. Edward is next to his father once more, though on the other side, and there are extra figures at the far right and left. In this instance, they are royal servants, however, not classical characters. Watch my other video to learn more about them. Again, the king is enthroned with an expensive carpet at his feet, a canopy of state above his head, and a coat of arms behind him. The biggest difference is the presence of the deceased Jane Seymour, which made sense at this point as she was the mother of the heir, while the actual queen at this time was the childless Catherine Parr. The tennis courts of Whitehall Palace can be seen in the background, and this portrait was at that palace in the 1570s when its dupe was painted. We can therefore be certain that whoever created the later picture saw this one, as the similarities are simply too great to be accounted for by any other explanation. We can also be sure that they studied other pictures of the real-life figures presented too, for they strongly resemble known portraits of this famous family. For the image of Henry VIII, we need look no further than the Whitehall mural by Hans Holbein, in which we see the king in the exact same outfit, and as the name suggests, it too was at Whitehall Palace. There is also Holbein's solo portrait of Henry. Edward is apparently based on the Scrott's image of him held at the Louvre, which I just saw and photographed recently, so that was a bit of luck. But personally, I don't see a striking resemblance myself, and to me, he is the least recognisable of the family members. For Mary, we can look to Hans Eworth's painting of her from 1554, held at the National Portrait Gallery in London, and there is also a portrait of her and Philip, now at Woburn Abbey, which looks like it was the blueprint for Philip's image. Elizabeth, of course, was alive and could be seen by the painter, so it was not necessary to copy a pre-existing portrait. The 1572 portrait wasn't just based on older pictures itself, though. It became an image on which later pictures were also based. This copy by an anonymous artist dates to around 1590 and was perhaps created to celebrate England's defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, for once again Spain had brought war, but peace had prevailed in Elizabeth's realm. We don't know who commissioned it, but it is now held in the Yale Centre for British Art in New Haven, Connecticut, and is a favourite of mine. If you've been with me for a while, you'll have noticed it pop up in many of my Tudor videos. I was lucky enough to see it in person a few years ago too, and I recommend a visit to the centre if you ever get the chance. I even prefer this to the original, as I think the colours are brighter and it's more attractive looking. I'll probably even use it as the thumbnail image for this video for those very reasons. I'm not going to provide a full description of it as I did with the original, as that would be pretty redundant, and instead I just want to draw your attention to some of the changes made between the two. For a start, Elizabeth's dress has been updated to include a larger ruff, in what I assume is an allusion to later fashions. Her face, of course, does not reflect the passage of time. Mary's dress might be a shade lighter too, more of a brown than a black, but there's no great alteration here. Next, in an oval frame in the bottom left of the image, we see a face. To me, this is the most significant change in the picture, the adding of an extra character. I'm not certain, but I think this might be Henry VIII's full Will Summer or Summers, who was one of the servants who appeared in the original Family of Henry VIII portrait from the 1540s. He looks similar to my mind, but I don't know why he would have been popped into this image, so perhaps I'm wrong and this is someone else. Maybe even the person who commissioned the picture or painted it. I have a whole video on Will's life, by the way, which I'll also link on screen and below for you. Other changes are pretty subtle, like Mary's dress, and I don't know if we need to read much into them beyond the fact that the artist might have found it easier to paint Edward holding a cushion rather than kneeling close to one, to have Elizabeth holding a glove rather than pointing at peace, and maybe the artist or their patron was a little more prudish about showing Plenty's chest, so her dress covers her up in this image, saving me the trouble of adding another modesty patch. The copy has undergone some restoration in recent years too, and that process has revealed some extra interesting details. Edward's eyes were vandalised with small puncture marks, for instance, though we don't know when or why, beyond the possibility that someone just really didn't like him. It has also been poorly restored in the past. Previous attempts to strengthen it with battens and wooden strips across the back of the wooden boards which make up the panel it is painted on have resulted in warping of the original boards and cracking of the paint. An earlier cleaning of the smalt pigment used in the sky portion of the painting has also damaged that portion of the image. The previous restoration, or restorations, of which there are no records, had also led to the boards being put back together slightly out of alignment. Fortunately, modern work can fix most of the problems so that the painting can continue to be enjoyed for generations to come. I hope you found this history and discussion of the hidden meanings behind this impossible Tudor portrait and its copy interesting. If you haven't done so already, do remember to check out my website, historycallingofficial.com, where you can join my mailing list and get a free download giving you some quick and easy tips on how to spot good versus bad history at a glance. It's linked below for you. Question of the day. Do you prefer the 1572 original or the 1590 copy, and why? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, you should definitely try one of these next, or else peruse my art history playlist, which has a much wider selection of options than I can show you here. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.